Today, South Korea is populated with approximately 52 million people and is home to one of the most technologically advanced cities in the world. But like all countries, their success was earned and worked for. After World War II, the United States and Soviet Union had to decide upon what to do with Japan's acquired territory, more specifically, Korea. Eventually, the State Department divided the Korean peninsula in half, a Soviet-occupied area in the north and an American-occupied area in the south. Both were divided by the 38th parallel. Quickly after, two new states had formed. In the south was an anti-communist dictator named Syngman Rhee, who created the Republic of Korea. In the north was a communist dictator named Kim Il-sung, who created the Democratic Peoples of Korea. North Korea wanted unification under communism, and South Korea the opposite. The division of the two areas caused trouble. Border skirmishes were fairly common, and nearly 10,000 North and South Koreans were killed before the Korean War even began. The Soviets withdrew their troops from the north, and American troops were withdrawn from the south. The two dictators would not accept the border between the other. The conflict is looked at as the first true test of the Cold War. On June 25, 1950, the tension between the Soviet-backed Democratic Peoples of Korea and anti-communist Republic of Korea strengthened, thus marking the start of the Korean War. 75,000 soldiers from the North Korean People's Army penetrated across the 38th parallel. The North Korean Army easily captured the heart of South Korea, Seoul. The North Korean Army was well-trained, disciplined, and dedicated, while the South Koreans were caught by surprise and left in fear when North Korea attacked. The only South Korean territory controlled was a small portion of the area called Pusan. South Korean forces were surrounded and called it the Pusan Perimeter. President Truman found this as a problem because he wanted to contain the spread of communism, and if South Korea was taken over, so would other countries to the political ideology. This was called the domino theory. Truman stated, "In my generation, this was not the first occasion when the strong had attacked the weak. Communism was acting in Korea just as Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese had acted 10, 15, and 20 years earlier. I felt that if South Korea was allowed to fall, communist leaders would be emboldened to override nations closer to our own shores." End quote. In the United Nations, the U.S. pushed a resolution through the Security Council, and the Soviets did not use their veto power because they were boycotting the rejection of China from the Council. As a result, an army was formed consisting of 16 different countries to provide assistance for South Korea. The army was led by General Douglas MacArthur, a World War II hero. In early July, troops were in South Korea but were pushed back by North Korean forces. After reinforcements came in, MacArthur was ready to strike an offensive. This was called the Incheon Landing or Operation Chromite. MacArthur stated, "Are you content to let our troops stay in the bloody perimeter like beef cattle in the slaughterhouse? Who will take the responsibility for such tragedy? Certainly I will not." End quote. On September 15, 1950, the U.S. launched an assault in the Battle of Incheon. The North Korean troops were pushed back over the 38th parallel and Seoul was taken back. President Truman, anticipating and fearing a Chinese attack, sent troops into North Korea and captured their capital, Pyongyang, and the Yalu River, which bordered China. This is a map of Korea. As you can see, it is a particularly small peninsula and had tough conditions to fight in. Dean Acheson, the U.S. Secretary of State, stated, "If the best minds in the world had set out to find us the worst possible location in the world to fight this war, the unanimous choice would have been Korea. In 1950, it was one of the hottest summers on record, and desperate American troops were forced to drink water from the rice paddies fertilized with human waste. As a result, disease and famine were a threat. Mao Zedong, who was the leader of China, sent 250,000 troops to help North Korea. The Allied forces were pushed back and overwhelmed by the attack with heavy losses. In the Battle of Chosin Reservoir on November 27 through December 13, 1950, the Chinese recovered northeastern North Korea in freezing weather. It was so cold which made it fighting tough, and it was nicknamed Frozen Chosin. The UN forces retreated out of North Korea after they were infiltrated from the port of Hungnam. Both forces suffered about 70,000 casualties in the Battle of Chosin alone. On January 4, 1951, the Chinese and North Koreans recaptured Seoul. A couple of months later, Seoul is once again liberated but is left in devastation. MacArthur stated, "I have seen, I guess, as much blood and disaster as any living man, and it just curdled my stomach," end quote. Seoul's population reduced to a fraction of its pre-war size. On April 11, 1951, President Truman relieved MacArthur for his insubordination and his unwillingness to fight a limited war. Truman wanted to pursue a limited war where no atomic weapons were used. The relief of General MacArthur is looked at as a controversial topic in the field of civil-military relations. At the battles of Kapyong, South Korea, the UN forces hold off an outnumbering Chinese army. 4,000 men of the British 29th Brigade held off 30,000 men of the Chinese 63rd Army, and the 650 men of the 1st Battalion engaged in a standoff against 10,000 Chinese infantry. Although most of the UN troops were killed or captured, their sacrifice allowed the UN forces to hold the South Korean capital. Talks about a truce began on July 10, 1951, at Kaesong, North Korea. In early 1953, Dwight D. Eisenhower took office and immediately sought out for an end to the war. After 2 more years of fighting, an armistice was finally signed. On July 27, 1953, Mark W. Clark of the United Nations, Peng Dehuai of the Chinese, and Kim Il-sung conclude with a ceasefire ending all hostilities. President Eisenhower states, "We now have gained a truce in Korea. We do not greet it with wild rejoicing. We know how dear its cost has been in life and treasure," end quote. A demilitarized zone is created along the 38th parallel. Syngman Rhee announces his acceptance, but no representatives of South Korea ever signed the armistice. As an armistice is only a formal agreement to hold off on fighting, the war was not officially over. The Korean War was relatively short but suffered significant losses. About 5 million deaths, and 2.5 million of them were civilians. More than 1.5 million were wounded, and almost 40,000 Americans died in action, and more than 100,000 were wounded. To this day, we thank all those who served. The United States played an essential role in protecting South Korea from communism. $67 million was spent in the war effort in Korea, and 90% of the UN forces were provided by the United States. The rate of civilian casualties were higher than World War II and the Vietnam War. Tensions have always been strong between North and South Korea, as well as the United States, even after the Korean War. Fortunately, history was made when North Korean leader Kim Jong-un was the first to cross the 38th parallel. South Korean President Moon Jae-in was waiting to greet him at the line. "There will not be any more war on the Korean peninsula. A new era of peace has begun," end quote, Moon stated. Kim stated, "We are not a people that should be confronting each other. We should be living in unity," end quote, he said. "We have long waited for this moment to happen, all of us," end quote. On April 27, 2018, the two met and agreed to sign a formal peace treaty, officially ending the war as well as nuclear disarmament. Today, there is a Korean War Memorial in Washington, D.C., remembering all the lives dedicated to provide assistance to a country in need. As a result of the Korean War, there were multiple effects on Korean civilization. Thousands of families were separated and were never reunited due to the division of North and South Korea, causing for tens of thousands of orphans and refugees. Also, after the Korean War, the South Korean economy suffered serious inflation, but for the U.S., military spending had fallen from $82 billion a year at the end of World War II to $13 billion in 1950, just 5% of gross national product. By the end of the Korean conflict, it was back to $50 billion, making war production a permanent feature of the U.S. industrial landscape. Today, South Korea is a capitalist nation and thrives off of many large corporations such as Samsung, Hyundai, Kia, and LG. Also, during the Korean War, the U.S. made a big stance on the war against communism by helping a small area like Korea from being taken over by the ideology. This would eventually lead into the Cold War, and it would show the U.S. would be willing to do anything to prevent communism. As for North Korea, they still remain as a communist nation. North Korea's gross domestic product per capita is a staggering 1,800 USD, while South Korea's is about 30,000 USD. Aside from the economic impacts of the Korean War, North and South Korea still share similarities such as celebrating the same holidays, foods, and roots of language. Although the two countries are separated, their hope for unification is strong. Throughout the Korean War, many civilians were forced to suffer. My grandmother was a 13-year-old girl when the North Koreans attacked on June 25, 1950. She fled Seoul alongside the rest of her family. She had 2 older brothers and 1 older sister. They fled southward to a relative's house in Okcheon, even in a safer place. My great-grandfather even went to the extent of digging an underground shelter under the hallway of the house to hide because North Korean soldiers searched every home and took the young people for their military and labor. While in the shelter, my great-grandparents delivered food for their children. My grandmother has stated countless times of the fear she had gone through of hearing the marching of North Korean soldiers. As the son of my grandmother, my father, Myung-Woo Kim, grew up during the post-war tensions even after 17 years of peace. He served in the mandatory South Korean military and was in a constant state of fear because of North Korean threats of a nuclear bomb. I knew that at any moment I had to say goodbye to my family and defend my country, end quote. My grandmother of my mother's side described a time when her family was forced to hide in the woods to prevent from being captured by North Korean soldiers. One day, she was confronted by a North Korean soldier and was asked for a meal. As a result, she stayed composed and fed the soldier and realized there could be peace between the two countries. She also stated that most South Koreans were sure that they were going to be taken over by a communist government after North Korean soldiers captured Seoul. But fortunately, after UN forces landed in Incheon, hope was restored for a democratic government. South Koreans welcomed the troops with much endearment, she stated. After the armistice, both of my grandmothers had similar responses of victory and triumph, and some sort of party commemorating the end of the war. But not everyone was content about the permanent separation of the countries. For many, it was the permanent separation of their families. My grandmother of my mother's side has a companion residing in Greensboro, North Carolina. That is one of the people separated from their family. She was born in Kaesong, North Korea in 1942. Before the beginning of the war, many North Korean civilians fled by train to the south. When waiting in the vigorous and desperate line for the train, she said that she lost sight of her family in the crowd. She expected her family to be on the train already, so she boarded the train. Hopeless and scared as an 8-year-old would be, she looked everywhere on the train, but there was no sight of her family. That day would be the last day she would ever see her parents and siblings. She said that such a small thing like not paying attention was the reason for the separation with my family forever, end quote. When she immigrated to the U.S., she was fortunate enough to be welcomed into an American household. Diana Lee was not the only person to suffer because of the division of Korea. The Korean War is nicknamed the Forgotten War because it is not remembered as a significant military accomplishment for the U.S. But the Forgotten War of one nation is the birth of two contrasting nations of the modern world. The Korean War was a symbol of the effort to contain communism throughout the 1900s. In an interview with my father and others, my father stated, "There are many lasting impacts of the Korean War, such as poverty, lost family, destroyed family value, barren land, death, political hatred, cultural disconnection, language barrier, and more. Most were negative impacts, but one positive thing I can think of is how poverty and national stress of war has united South Korea. Thirsty for justice, passionate for restoration of the ancient Korean noble spirit, enthusiastic for successful life, and thus hard work," end quote. Today, a new generation is taking over, and South and North Korea are making more progress than ever of reuniting once again.